Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we are going to overclock the AM2 Athlon64 3200 Plus, and we are going to look at the charts to see how it compares to the other CPUs we had in this series. We will start by going to the BIOS. In the Advanced tab, we are going to select the CPU AGP asynchronous for the overclock mode, and push the CPU frequency as much as we can. In this case, there's a barrier at 232 MHz, as it was the case with the ASRock 4-core Dual and the Pentium 4. We are going to leave the AGP frequency to 66. This shouldn't be touched, as it does nothing to help the overclock. More so, by raising it, it may create issues. Unfortunately, the voltage cannot be raised over 1.3 volts, which is the default for this CPU. The rest of the options concerning the memory are left like they were in the stock settings, with 3335 timings and a 200 MHz memory clock. In the chipset configuration, there's a very important setting, the CPU North Bridge link speed. For most motherboards, this is a ratio number. The general rule for the N-Force-free motherboards is that you need to pick this number so that multiplying it by the CPU frequency, the result is always under 800. ASRock has made things a bit confusing here by showing the result of the multiplication, but with the default frequency. Benchmarks show that this frequency has minor or no influence on the overall results. For now, we are going to set the ratio to 3, or 600 MHz, and leave the rest of the settings as they were. Since every attempt to run PCMark 2002 on Windows XP, even with a one frontside bus overclocked CPU, resulted in a crash, I decided to use Windows 7. From the benchmarks I've seen, between Windows XP and Windows 7, there's a maximum 1% drop in score in Windows 7. So for now we are going to accept this, but we will have a look at these differences at a later date. We will also take this opportunity to look at CPU-Z. The RAM was overclocked 1-to-1 with the frontside bus, but the latencies stayed the same. Now let's go back to Windows XP for the rest of the tests and start with SuperPi. It manages a decent 37.5 seconds for the time, which puts this CPU in line with the other Athlon64s given the overclock. Now let's look at the other tests. It's now time for the charts, and we start with SuperPi. The stock frequency manages an even longer time than the 939 Athlon, although both CPUs have 90 nanometers and both have 512 kilobytes of level 2 cache. The overclocked result given the frequency is in between the other two Athlons. Cinebench 03 paints the same picture, where the stock settings is exactly the same as the Athlons from 2 and 3 years ago. The encoding is exactly the same for the stock settings. PC Mark is no different, and even if I was expecting a little more out of this CPU, in the memory section the DDR2 doesn't make any difference. In all of Sandra's tests, it's a real surprise that these CPUs are equal under stock settings. The dual channel also shows the difference from single channel, but DDR2 doesn't make any difference. Even CPU bench shows the same score, with a little variation in the arithmetic logical unit section. I was really hoping to see some advancements in the level 1 or level 2 cache speeds, and I also hoped DDR2 would shine in the memory tests. But after all, I was forcing it to run on 200 MHz, and also the Enforce 3 chipset is rather old for this CPU. And all the charts for the games are no different. It looks like I was benchmarking the same CPU 3 times. My thoughts when comparing the results for AM2 Athlon64 were, what a terrible waste of time. Has AMD done nothing in the last 3 years? But then I realized that they kept their promise and delivered another contender for the Pentium 4 4200, for a fraction of the price, with a 3-year delay. What was truly worrying was that 3 years later there was no improvement in the efficiency department. And this goes to show the issues AMD will be struggling with during the next decade. It also shows that AMD was a bit stuck in the past, and although it had the lead over Intel in early 2004 with the 939 Athlon64, in 2006 it was still comparing its CPUs to 2003 Pentiums, being content just to follow in Intel's footsteps. This CPU was no longer top of the line, nor it was positioned in the middle of the lineup. It was the most basic Athlon you could have for socket AM2. The good news from all these is that this CPU should be cheap. An AM2 motherboard should also be cheap. Even a graphics card that will be more than able to handle 2003 games should be cheap. And all these tests show that the difference to the original Athlon XP and even the following Athlon64s should be minimal. Let's not forget that AM2 socket appeared after the capacitor plague was over, and there's a better chance to find one in working order rather than a socket A. After all, this was not lost time, but rather discovering a 2003 CPU potential in a much newer and modestly priced CPU. Thank you, and see you next time.